All right, Tom, I think we're rolling. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity, John.
As you're aware, we're part of this launch of the Global Learning Equity Network, an attempt to put learning and learning how to teach in the same space as equity around a rethink of teacher education as we know it. Around the world, and particularly New South Wales leading the world, we've done a pretty good job of developing standards, entrance requirements, exit requirements, and really high level of expectation of every new teacher coming out and of every current teacher in the business. But here at the University of Newcastle, and given our participants at this conference, we're looking to think if the curriculum of teacher ed doesn't need a total refresh, given those frameworks that each of us around the world is operating under. And I'm really curious, and I think our participants are really curious about your perspective on the future of teacher preparation and how it might align with what we're here today to talk about.
Well, thanks, John, and it's an important opportunity for me as well to reflect on the underpinnings of our work. And I think the place I'd want to start just briefly is the most global and generalised level, and to say that what we're aware of and what informs a lot of our approach is the fact that more than ever, it's always been true, but more than ever, education is the most significant public policy tool for creating social and economic equity, not just within nations and societies and economies, but globally. And that is more than ever now much more acute because we're in an environment foreseeably of relatively low economic growth. And in the pressure release of economic growth is unlikely to be available to us in the same way that it was for perhaps a whole century before. So with the knowledge that we've accumulated through the affluence and development of that century, we have the emphasis on equity as a legacy, but perhaps without the economic growth that facilitated that knowledge development. Now, that is a long way of saying more than ever before, education and therefore teaching are significant. And economies such as ours are going to be relying on teaching and education for a relative advantage, socially and economically. When that happens, in my view, policymakers in the political sphere generally are thinking in two terms. Either marketising, if you like, creating a liberal competition of what is quality and how do you achieve it, or increasingly intervening and regulating. Neither of those are particularly conducive to building the professional culture that underpins genuine quality over the longer term. Though I would make the case, and perhaps from a vested interest, but I truly believe, that between the two, regulation is more likely to be helpful if it's done well than a simple marketised competition, particularly in the context of equity, because we know an open liberal approach for all its advantages for energy, creating energy, also exacerbate very often inequities. So that puts then the pressure on the regulatory frame to be one that allows for a culture of intellectual ambition, rather than what regulation can do, which is to diminish the potential to meet certain minimum core requirements that meet some sort of code, which is, what regulation becomes. So the subsequent question challenge for regulation, in fact, and for the profession as well, is some sort of discourse that goes to what constitutes a quality that is as varied and sophisticated and recognition of contingencies as it can be while still being concrete, right? Because that's our problem. Educators are very well known in the broader community for saying, well, it's not as simple as that. Well, actually, the community says, what is it as simple as? Because we then invite regulators to come in and demand certain things. And the relationship of what we do to an evidentiary base and the profession's confidence in pushing that evidence so that the profession wins the argument. Now, to do that, we cannot afford we will not do it, firstly, let me say, simply by having standards. Standards, the way we do, are a reference point for a discussion. If they become more than that, they diminish our potential. We can't afford to be diminished. We have to grow exponentially, not just stand still. but they are a useful reference point for the type of discussion you and I are having now and our colleagues are viewing. But what we do have to do is as I say, become sophisticated, but then also push the issue of ourselves on the issue of evidence. And we can't afford to rely on the existing understandings and the existing positions, I should say. Not the understanding, we understand them, let's build on them, but the positions which have become subject to their own cultural contestation and political polarisation, and in defending ourselves in one corner or another, we've cemented positions rather than allowed ourselves to open up. So in the work that you're doing, I hardly hear anything, and yet it could be so important. The idea of how the brain works. I mean, why we're not open to this? Well, is it because, and I think it is partly, the profession has been subjected to so much undermining criticism and political advantage, and I'm not talking about any particular situation, everyone will recognise this in their own context. Political advantage that accrues from people saying, well, teaching's not good enough because, of course, everyone feels they've got a child at risk, so they're going to be open to that sort of argument. So in defending ourselves, we tie ourselves to the sort of sociological base from which we emanate, and we don't want to discard by any means. But by tying ourselves to that, are we then setting aside the potential learning that the profession will need to grow and stake its claim in the mindset, in the cultural discourses, in the politics of this what is likely to be a highly contested future?
Yeah, Tom,
that's a nutshell for me, John.
Yeah, it's a perfect fit to our conversation at this symposium. And I think what you've done is make sure that our colleagues inside of Teacher Ed aren't threatened by the high level of expectation that's actually implied by the regulation. We can default to ticking boxes and getting approval, but is that good enough? And what we're here today to do, and what I know we'll be working with you on, is what would be ways that we really understand what it'd be like to help every child have an amazing life, where their passion and their knowledge just allows them to become who they want to be so our society can be. And then what's the characteristics of a teacher that helps them accomplish that, with teachers as so much the cornerstone of the future of our society. So I think what you've done is frame it really, really well.
And we need internally, not on the basis of being pressured, internally to seek common or shared understandings, and of course do that on the basis that they need to be sophisticated rather than reduced and simple. So do we all agree, and if we do, then let's put it aside, that a strong content knowledge is the basis for pedagogical flexibility? Do we all agree that there are some learnings are more hierarchical than others, and let's note which they are? Do we all agree that every teacher needs to have a range of strategies available? And that, in fact, for me, another key point, do we all agree that it's enormously difficult to generalise about the nature of learning at every year level across a domain of different subject areas for different personalities? You know, I mean, but do we all agree that we should not use that as an excuse to identify common understandings and progress on the basis of them? Because that's what we too often do. We say, well, it's much too complicated, you don't quite understand. No, it's complicated, and we need to articulate it in a way that indicates to others that we understand the complexity and will act nonetheless.
Well, and how I translate that to our own programs, are we satisfied that tucked into the first year or early the second year, one course in educational psychology taught in a large lecture hall with wonderful staff doing great things is good enough to capture some of those dynamic natures of what learning is, how it happens, how it occurs, and apply that in practicum and internships? Because I don't think any of us are satisfied that our models are there yet on what you just spoke about. So at the end, I think we'll be proposing some variations to the scope, sequence, substance, and almost philosophy behind what we do inside of our programs.
We can't afford to be captured by our history, to be reliant on it. And I do believe that we have a strong sociological basis, which is an asset, not to discard, but needs to be complemented by other disciplines and domains. I believe, along with issues of psychology, for example, that our profession generally lacks confidence, generally, I'm generalizing, lacks confidence with regard to quantitative research relative to qualitative. Mm-hmm. That there are substantial philosophical underpinnings that are part of our legacy, that we think in terms of principle and education as a process, which is important, as distinct from a share of a good. But so that when you don't regard it as a share of a good, you're resistant to measuring that share. Of course, if you're not measuring that share, you're setting aside the fact that some kids are getting a lot more of it than others. Mm-hmm. So a sophisticated, contingent and varied, contingent on the issue at the time, will be the hallmarks of a productive profession for teaching, as it is for any other.
Yeah, Tom, we really appreciate your joining the conference in absentia and look forward to bringing forward the ideas we've come up with, and also your great team that helps us day to day get it done, involved in thinking through where we go from here, because this is a conversation across all sectors. And we in Teacher Ed want to include those experts both inside and outside the field in this conversation. So we appreciate your time today and your expertise and your collegiality in joining us in this format.
John, thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing to be part of a very important conversation.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tom.